Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's Azure update. It's the 21st of November, and it's the Friday after Ignite, so it is the Ignite special. So there are a ridiculous number of updates. I've tried to capture all of the ones that I think are the most applicable. The chapters are just a high-level groupings. I would not be able to fit all of the updates on the chapters screen, but I'm trying to group it by the most logical categories. New videos this week. So I dived into how Azure Front Door provides resiliency. I talk a little bit about, obviously, the outages in October, and then also what you can do if you're a mission critical app and you can never rely on any single particular service. And then I did speak at Ignite. I did BRK 243, all about the Entra AI related capabilities. So you can go and check that out. So on to what's new, and we'll start off with the AKS related updates. So the Azure CNI powered Cilium networking now offers an eBPF host routing as part of the Advanced Container Network services. And really what that means is it moves the routing logic directly into the kernel instead of looking at the regular IP tables and the net filters. So it removes that lag and also reduces the CPU overhead that is not supported on Windows hosts. The CNI overlay now allows for CIDR expansion. So remember, CNI overlay already uses a separate CIDR range from that of the nodes for the pods. I have a certain VNet range I specify of a certain size. Then each node is assigned a /24 from that pod CIDR range. Well, that CIDR range I defined for the pods, I can now expand it. I cannot shrink it. I cannot add non-contiguous spaces on top of it. I cannot try to use a new range. The larger range I specify must contain the existing range. So imagine I currently had like a /18 for my pod CIDRs. Well, I could now expand it to a /16 or 17 to be able to now have more nodes to give out more pods. This is only for IPv4 CIDR ranges, and it is the Linux nodes only. For app service, Python 3.10 is retiring, basically beginning of October 2026, so you need to move to a newer version. Logic Apps has a redesigned designer. Remember, Logic Apps is that low-code way to create applications. It has a ridiculous number of different connectors that you can go and drag and drop onto the designer to make a very complex workflow. So what this is doing is it's moving the workflow editing and the run history closer together. So it makes it to iterate, improve, and troubleshoot your workflows. You can even add little notes on the canvas for easier collaboration with others and just your own documentation. And as a note, in GA is actually a new automated testing ability when I use VS Code and the Logic App standard extension. So that will actually go and generate the unit tests and help edit your own custom tests and even execute them locally. Also, for Logic Apps, it has agent loop updates. So if you think about Logic Apps, it has been increasing its AI agent capabilities. And the agent loop is a pattern within Logic Apps that enables it to receive an input. This could be text or an event. It can perform actions like calling a tool, using the huge library of connectors, generating some text, and executing that and repeating it while maintaining the context. Now, the agent loop is GA in Logic App Standard, and it's preview in the consumption plans. But what I can now do as part of those agent loops is I can leverage MCP servers. Remember, the whole point of Model Context Protocol is a server can provide additional knowledge, additional tooling, and it reflects those capabilities in a way that my AI app can just pass it directly to large language model. I don't have to try and explain it myself. So now I can leverage those MCP servers as part of those Logic App, those AI loops. I can scope access at a document level to data. I can bring in my own models from Microsoft Foundry and also now deploy agents into Microsoft Teams. So a whole set of nice capabilities there. And then also Logic Apps has new connectors. So in GA, is the Confluent Kafka connector, an XML connector. So it's going to be really easy to then parse and compose XML documents. It has an inline code capability. So normally Logic Apps is that visual designer. Well, if I find I need something maybe that is very long-winded to do graphically or just can't do it, C#, PowerShell, and JavaScript, I can now add as an inline code capability. There's a RabbitMQ connector, which is really good for reliable messaging. And then in public preview, there are 2 healthcare connectors, HL7 and MLLP. And in private preview is an ActiveMQ JMS connector. For virtual machines, the scheduled actions has gone GA. So that lets me schedule certain power actions like starting, stopping, hibernating, and it then just goes and performs those control plane calls for you at the time you specify. But in addition to just scheduling the things, there's normally a certain number of ARM operations I can perform. So what this does is actually allows a higher concurrent number of those calls to happen than if I was trying to do it to ARM the Azure control plane directly, and it will retry if there are actually problems. New virtual machine SKUs. So the EBSV6, which is available with and without temporary storage, up to 192 virtual CPUs, 1,832 gigabytes of memory, up to 800,000 IOPS and 14 gigabytes per second of remote disk performance. So that's 2 times higher than the previous generation for that remote performance. So it's really focused on very large database workloads, warehouse type applications. And then the NCV6 uses the NVIDIA RT Pro 6000 BSE GPUs aimed at video streaming, graphics rendering, AI development. And that is available as a compute optimized, a memory optimized, and a general purpose version, which is all about the ratio of the CPU to the memory based on exactly what you're trying to do. For app service, we now have customizable error pages in GA. So instead of a regular 403 error page going, I can create my own error page, my own 403 that would get displayed instead of those standard ones. Azure Functions now supports Node.js 24 for Windows 64-bit, not 32-bit, and Linux. And there's also now Java 25 is supported on Windows and Linux as well. Continuing compute. The Azure Red Hat OpenShift offering now supports the OpenShift virtualization capability. So what that means is I can now have both containers and VMs running on the same platform, and that includes the migration of on-premises virtual machines. Azure Boost now supports confidential devices in preview. Remember, Azure Boost is a separate card in the nodes that make up the Azure platform, and it lets the node offload certain types of networking and storage operations to this card. So it increases performance, but it reduces the CPU overhead. When we think about confidential virtual machines that have that encrypted even when in use, what this lets it do is it can expand that trust boundary to include the Boost card. So now I can get those Boost benefits even for the confidential workloads. And then another bunch of AKS, probably should have reorganized that a bit better. So AKS Network Watcher is in preview. So the AKS Network components will now integrate with the broader Azure network ecosystem, making it to understand the complete picture. AKS Desktop is available in preview. So Windows, Linux, Mac, it's basically a UI. So it's a UI for the deployment of applications without you having to go and create Kubernetes manifests. And it'll actually generate those for you behind the scenes. I can view my Kubernetes environment. I can view its health, metrics. It actually works across Kubernetes environments, different clouds. But at this point, it is optimized for AKS Automatic clusters. Remember, AKS Automatic is all about it has the best practices automatically applied, and it maintains those for you. AKS Pod Sandboxing has gone GA. So that's where every single pod runs in an isolated VM. Ordinarily, containers have a user mode isolation, but they share a kernel. So what this does is it actually uses the Kata. It's an open source Kata container behind the scenes to give it its own mini, very low overhead virtual machine, which means it has its own kernel. So if there was any concerns about the neighborhood workloads on, I mean, it's my container host, but if I was still concerned, well, for my Azure Linux container host, I can run these Kata containers, and then I get that kernel mode isolation as well. AKS Managed Namespace has gone GA. So the management and lifecycle of namespaces, I just create the namespace, I assign users to the namespace, I can set network policies, I can set resource limits, and it will go and take care of all of that behind the scenes. And for AKS Automatic, it now has a pod readiness SLA. So what it's basically saying is within 5 minutes at a 99.9% tile, the eligible pods will be ready. So that's now backed by a financial credit. The Kubernetes Fleet Manager for Arc is now in preview. So obviously the Fleet Manager is all about managing Kubernetes clusters at scale. Well, with the Arc Kubernetes support, any Kubernetes cluster that's CNCF compatible that has the Azure for Arc Kubernetes deployed to it can now be managed through Fleet Manager as well. And AKS Automatic now has managed system node pools. So it will automatically provision, upgrade, scale your system node pools. Windows Server 2025 is now supported for my AKS. Obviously, Server 2025 actually has a significant number of container improvements over 2022. And obviously, if you look, I think 2019, 2022, there's a certain retirement schedule. So you probably want to go and get on the newer version. The Azure Container Registry now has attribute-based access control in GA. So now, based on specific attributes, I can add those rules on top of the normal role assignments. So you have the normal role assignment, hey, you have this permission on the container registry, and then you add more conditions based on some expression. For example, the repository name has to have a certain prefix, then I get that role assigned. So that is now available in GA. And AKS, the Advanced Container Network Services, now has layer 7 policies. So it understands HTTP, HTTPS, gRPC, and more. So I can be more granular in the application of the policies and also returning more specific types of error code. And also, the cluster-wide Cilium network policy is also now GA, as is its local redirect policy. So the redirect policy is really nice. If you imagine I have a Kubernetes-based service that wants to talk to another Kubernetes-based service, well, they're going to be serviced by different sets of pods. So what local redirect does is when your service tries to talk to another service, it will say, hey, are there pods on the same node as me that provide that service? In which case, let's talk to those. So it would reduce the latency. So that's there as well. Also in preview for my Cilium cluster networking is ingestion metrics and filters. So with the filter, I can optimize to say only capture these particular metrics, which means less data going to the storage, which means less overall costs. And for the AKS KAITO toolchain, which lets me run AI models and inferencing and training on an AKS environment, it now supports MCP servers. So I can bring additional tooling to those language models running on the toolchain. And still more compute, Azure Functions now has an MCP extension. So what it's really going to do is I have an Azure function, which remember is pro code. It will turn it into a remote MCP server. So it's going to expose that Azure function as a tool. And so now when an AI app tries to call it with serverless, it will trigger the Azure function to execute. And hey, now it's an MCP server. I can even take existing MCP servers and host them on Azure Functions as well. The Azure Functions Durable Task Scheduler is basically designed for complex workflows. It automatically checkpoints its progress. It's GA for dedicated SKUs, and it's public preview for the consumption SKU. And the Azure Functions now has OpenTelemetry support. So OpenTelemetry is really all about, hey, your logs, your traces, your metrics being available and being able to be consumed by any OpenTelemetry compliant backend, which includes Azure Monitor. So now Azure Functions also can emit its logs, traces, metrics in that standard, making it more available to be used in other platforms. So for Azure Container Apps, there's a whole set of updates. So in preview, I can now use Docker Compose directly in Azure Container Apps. I normally use Docker Compose when I want to define and run multi-container-based applications. It also has flexible workload profiles. So in my consumption serverless model, but also I still get planned maintenance windows, I get dedicated networking, and also the option to use larger replica sizes. And it brings trusted execution environments to the containers. So remember, trusted execution environments are all about the idea of, we already think about encryption in transit, encryption at rest. Well, now this is encryption in use. So the memory, the processing happening, that stays encrypted as well. It has dynamic shell sessions. So these are platform managed. So if I want to run and execute some shell command, it will spin that up automatically for me to let me run that in an isolated sandbox. And I can also now assign labels like your dev, your staging, your prod to specific container revisions. Think of a revision as a version of my container app config. And then with those labels, I can route traffic. So maybe I want to split the traffic. Maybe I want to use it for staging and then release. But those are now available in preview. So in GA, though, I can now use serverless GPUs. So if I think about AI inferencing, model training, or just general GPU accelerated workloads, I just pay on a per second GPU use. I have rule-based routing, enabling traffic to be routed based on rules specified, for example, based on some part of the requested URL. So the request is coming in as part of the path of the request. I could send it to this set of Azure Container Apps. If it's a different path, send it to another set of container apps. So that is now available. There's also premium ingress. So I can scale the number of ingress proxy instances to support potentially higher demand workloads. Azure App Gateway, remember that regional layer load 7 load balancing, which can include web application firewall. So in preview, it supports JSON Web Token or JOP to be validated at the app gateway. So what that means is it's going to make sure the JOP token is valid, perform authentication before it ever even gets to the back end. So I can help protect it from that. In GA is mutual TLS pass through. So backend applications can still perform client certificate and auth header validation even when it goes through WAF. Also in GA, App Gateway can now terminate both TCP, so layer 4, and TLS connections, layer 7. So it can work with HTTP web pages and also non-HTTP based applications. It's an interesting one. So App Service Managed Instance is available in preview. So the goal here is I have some .NET app that maybe I'm doing custom runtimes. I'm talking to some local Windows service. There's some third-party vendor library that wouldn't ordinarily just work in App Service. Well, now I can run it in this managed instance of App Service that even includes RDP access to that instance via Bastion. So it gives me a lot more flexibility, enabling me to move my .NET apps that maybe ordinarily I would not be able to run in App Service. And ARM64 images now can support trusted launch in GA. So I have an ARM64 image in the marketplace. It can be a Gen 2 VM, which means it gets the virtual TPM, which means it can use secure boot to attest from the hardware through to the OS, and I get that full trusted launch experience. And Azure Sphere OS 2510 is GA. That's really used by Internet of Things devices. On to networking. So the App Gateway Web Application Firewall now has this HTTP DDoS rule set 1.0 for the V2 version of the SKU. So it's going to help protect against HTTP layer DDoS attacks. What's special about this is it adapts the protection based on, it's going to look at what the normal traffic is, and then it will block based on both attack surges without having to do any sort of manual tuning, but it also integrates with Microsoft Threat Intelligence for bot detection. So it would look for like high rate client and anomalies. I'm tired. I got up at 2 to update and record this. And it learns at both a gateway and an IP address level. And also App Gateway for containers now has slow start in GA. So imagine you have the load balancing algorithm. Well, a new pod springs to life. Well, instead of just blasting it with traffic, I can give it a configurable time window to enable it to smoothly scale up and get a high reliability. It also has integration with Istio Service Mesh via an extension, which can help with sort of north-south traffic flow. Azure Flow Logs now has filtering. So this replaced the NSG flow logs, which means I had to have a network security group that limited where I could use it. So now I can say, hey, based on the IP address, the port, the protocol, the encryption state, the flow state, and many more, only capture that traffic. So I can optimize to the specific scenario that I care about. ExpressRoute Scalable Gateway has gone GA. So this can achieve up to 40 gigabits per second. And it's just going to scale automatically with no downtime. Now, ideally, we use FastPath. So with FastPath, it doesn't ingress via the gateway. Nothing ever egresses via the gateway. But in those scenarios I can't use FastPath, this would be really useful to achieve that higher scale for those various scenarios where FastPath is not supported. Azure Virtual Network Manager now has cross-region IP address management. So I have an IP address pool. I can allocate it to a virtual network in a different region. Also now it will detect IP address overlap when I try and add a virtual network into a mesh. So a mesh connectivity group is where every VNet can talk to every other. So as I try and add a new virtual network into that, it will check what's its IP address space. And if that IP address space of the VNet conflicts with existing members, well, the traffic wouldn't route properly. So it will alert me to that and stop me having that problem. And actually pretty exciting is NAT Gateway v2. So NAT Gateway is all about that resource I deploy that is used for the internet-based egress traffic from resources in the virtual network. Now, the problem before is NAT Gateway v1, it could be regionally deployed or deployed to a particular zone, but there was no zone redundant option. Well, my virtual networks and my subnets do not align typically to zones. So it made it quite hard to architect a resilient solution using NAT Gateway. So now with the v2, it does have a zone redundant option. It will survive a zonal failure, so it makes it easier to use in my zone redundant architectures. It also supports up to 100 gigabits per second of throughput. It supports 16 IPv6 and 16 IPv4 addresses. So yep, it's got IPv6 support, and it uses a new standard v2 type of IP address, and it also supports flow logs. And Azure DNS now has threat intelligence feed in GA. So I can have Azure DNS security policies, which applies to any public and private DNS traffic within a VNet. Well, it will now use a threat intelligence feed to detect DNS queries for malicious domains, so that it could then either alert or actually block it completely. On to storage. So Blob Storage Archive tier is now available in the Taiwan North region. Remember, archive is essentially offline. I can put data I have to keep but don't need immediate access to in the archive tool for really, really cheap storage. Azure NetApp Files has a number of updates. So large volume breakthrough mode is in preview. So I can have up to 2 PB of capacity with a throughput of up to 50 GB per second. There's some variation based on the workload, but those are numbers that can be achieved. Also, Azure NetApp Files large volumes available in preview up to 7.2 PB with call access. So that regular 2 PB limit is there, but then the less frequent data can go to the call tier, that call access, so a total of up to 7.2 PB. I can now get quota reports of both individual user and group quotas. So what is the limit? What is the current utilization? And there is an Azure NetApp Files migration assistant. So using the Snap Mirror technology, it can migrate from filers on-prem or other clouds into Azure NetApp Files. And Azure NetApp Files cache volumes are available in preview. So imagine you have a NetApp filer outside of Azure. Maybe it's on-prem. Then I have cloud workloads. What a cache volume will do is it will cache data in Azure NetApp Files for that outside of Azure volume for that hot data. So the data that's been accessed would now be available near to my Azure applications stored in that cache. Azure Files SMB now has an Entra-only mode. So previously, I always had to have some kind of Active Directory or Entra domain services available, well, now I don't. I can do a pure Entra-only authentication to control that access to my Azure Files SMB shares. Oh, and Azure NAT Files now has a single file restore option in GA. I don't have to restore the entire volume, just pick the files I want. And storage smart tiering is available in preview. So this is for Azure Blob Storage and Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, which is a storage account with hierarchical namespace. Now, there are multiple tiers. There's hot, cool, cold, and archive. Forget about archive for now. Remember, that's kind of offline. So the idea is normally we use the hotter tiers for data we're accessing a lot. I pay more for the capacity, but less for the interactions. The less I interact with it, well, I can move it to a cool or a cold tier. And I could write rules. There were storage actions. I could use lifecycle management to go and do that. But now what we can actually do is smart tiering is just fully managed and automated. It will automatically move the data between the tiers, respecting minimum times that have to have data in a tier to avoid paying an early move charge. It will move it around to optimize my cost automatically. Azure Managed Lustre has a number of updates. So remember, Lustre is really good for high-performance compute workloads. It has really good support for parallel interactions with the data. So it can now be configured to automatically import data from Azure Blob. There's a new 20 megabyte per second per terabyte performance tier available. In GA, it's also now supported by the Azure MCP server, which means that I can use natural language talking to the Azure MCP server to actually go and manage my Azure Managed Lustre instances. Also, there is an Azure Managed Lustre container storage interface. So think about now in my AKS environment, I can use Azure Managed Lustre to back my persistent volumes. Database. So Cosmos DB now has an online container copy in preview. So it's just going to copy the contents of one container to another container in real time, but the source can still be in use. So maybe I just need another copy. Maybe I want to change the partition key. Maybe I want to update the unique keys, or there's some other feature I can only turn on at creation time. Well, it will leverage the change feed to just ensure all the data is copied over. It is going to consume throughput units on both the source and the target, but I can essentially do it while it's online. Azure DocumentDB is available in preview. This is a new managed offering. It is using the open source DocumentDB, which provides a MongoDB compatible database. And actually, this was previously known as Azure Cosmos DB for MongoDB vCore. I can have very high performance storage, up to 64 terabytes of capacity, 80,000 IOPS, 1,200 megabytes per second per physical shard. So remember, I can split the data over nodes. I can have up to 10 of those nodes in a cluster without having to go and raise a support ticket. It has automatic scaling. It is AI ready with built-in vector and hybrid search. And there's a VS Code extension that will actually advise you on indexes. So it can help me view and debug my database performance and let me just interact using natural language. Also, that extension will let me migrate from MongoDB workloads into Azure DocumentDB. There's an online and offline mode. In GA, though, it can actually migrate from Azure Cosmos DB for MongoDB RU, again, online and offline. Fabric Databases has gone GA. So this is both for the SQL Server and the Cosmos DB NoSQL operational database. I can now just spin up in Fabric. So I no longer have to go to different places. Okay, I'm in Fabric, I've got my one lake with all my different data. Oh, I need an operational database. I can just create it directly in Fabric. And what's nice is the data will automatically be mirrored into the Fabric One Lake, so then it can integrate with all the other analytics and pipeline and various capabilities. I don't have to write an extract, transform, load pipeline to do that. As part of that, I can also now easily mirror Cosmos DB instances into Microsoft Fabric, and I can also mirror PostgreSQL Flexible into One Lake. So they've done a whole lot of work about making it easy to get data into that Fabric One Lake. Cosmos DB's NoSQL now has fuzzy search. So fuzzy search is a full text search, but I've done a typo. I got a couple of characters wrong, and it will still now find those matches with a few minor issues without any problems. The Cosmos DB vector search has some performance improvements. Remember, vectors are everything. When we think about AI and its natural language, we always struggle with, well, one word can mean many different things. Many different words can mean the same thing. So I care about the semantic meaning. And the way we do that is we create these high dimensional vectors that represent the semantic meaning of data. And then we have to be able to find the nearest neighbor, the closest match to that using vectors and math. So it's improved those vector inserts and index builds to allow a higher throughput and a lower latency during a large ingestion. So it can handle a larger data set, but also because it's more efficient, it will use less request units as part of it. And I can even use a float 16 now if I want to. So for the vectors, I'll use a float 16 to store them, which means it's like half the amount of storage, but it still has a really high recall accuracy. The VS Code extension is GA for Cosmos DB, so I can go and interact directly with my Cosmos DB data directly in my VS Code environment. And also there are priority executions available in GA. So for every request, I can assign the request a low or high priority. And obviously the higher priority ones will be prioritized over the lower ones in terms of the processing. We now have Cosmos DB Fleet pools. So I can create a pool of request units that can then be shared by multiple Cosmos DB accounts that are placed into that fleet. So it maybe gives me a more efficient way of using those request units. And then kind of in partnership with this, I now have Cosmos DB Fleet Analytics. So this will provide me a single analytics view across all those Cosmos DB instances within the fleet. So they work very, very well together. Cosmos DB also now has dynamic data masking in preview. So it's a server-side feature. And what will happen is the data that is in scope via the filters I define would be masked from those non-privileged users. So typically we hide things like PII data. So it doesn't change anything in the database itself, only what is returned. I could hide the entire field or maybe just a selection of the field. Hey, show the first character and the last character, but nothing in between it. On the Postgres side, so the Oracle to PostgreSQL migration capability is available via the PostgreSQL extension for VS Code. It will convert the Oracle schemas. It will convert the app code to the PostgreSQL equivalents. We normally like using PostgreSQL for Oracle migrations because they share a lot of similar capabilities and syntax for things. The PostgreSQL 2025 REST API has gone GA. So this is an API to manage and automate the PostgreSQL instances. It's about the resource, not the data. I'm not managing tables or rows. It's about the Azure instance of PostgreSQL. Well, now it supports PostgreSQL 17 and 18. It has better example scenarios built in. So that is now GA. PostgreSQL flexible elastic clusters has gone GA. So elastic clusters leverage the Citus extension. The Citus extension lets us shard a database over multiple instances. So that lets me have a higher scale, a higher performance. I can shard at a schema level or a row level. Row level sharding is really good. If you've got some sort of multi-tenant app and I want to put different tenants across different shards. I can do an in-place upgrade now to version 18. So now I don't have to change the endpoint. I don't have to migrate data across. I don't have to change my applications. There is downtime, but it's going to be far less than would be associated if I was having to go and actually migrate the data. PostgreSQL is now integrated with Microsoft Foundry. So the PostgreSQL MCP server is now just natively available. So when I'm building my agents in Foundry, they can easily integrate with my PostgreSQL data. And also now the PostgreSQL VS Code extension works with GitHub Copilot. So GitHub Copilot provides those natural language interactions and assistance. I can use that. There's a new Anon extension supported, which has masking capabilities, as we kind of talked about for the Cosmos DB. So PII information can be hidden away at the query time. Also, there's a DuckDB extension. So what DuckDB does is for vectorized, columnar data, it's an execution engine. So I bring that execution engine into PostgreSQL, which is really, really good for analytics. And PostgreSQL can now actually interact with Parquet-based data. So PostgreSQL can now read and write Parquet files directly from the database. Remember, Parquet is the same format used with Microsoft Fabric's OneLake. So by able to talk directly to Parquet data, it can simplify a lot of data workflows. I don't have to try and, again, do those sort of ETL type things. I can just go and talk to it. PostgreSQL Flexible now has V6 VMs. That's both the memory optimized and general purpose and the AMD confidential compute virtual machine SKUs. And then a big one. So Azure HorizonDB is available. I think it's private preview right now. So Azure HorizonDB is Microsoft's own forked version of PostgreSQL. Whereas PostgreSQL Flexible uses the standard community PostgreSQL version. So the features and capabilities will be the same for any PostgreSQL hosting out there. This is a forked version. So this lets Microsoft enhance and change to do additional neat things. So what AWS did with Aurora and Google did with AlloyDB, HorizonDB is Microsoft's version of its own fork of PostgreSQL. Now, like PostgreSQL Flexible, it will support single instance and elastic multi-node clusters. Write latency is about 1 millisecond compared to 2 to 3 milliseconds on Flexible. It is zone redundant by default. It supports up to 128 terabytes and over 3,000 vCores. It has a 99.995% SLA with a sub 10-second failover time. And all of the AI features like disk ANN vector indexing is there that you would support. It's fully integrated with Entra, with private endpoints, and I can have up to 15 read replicas. So, some exciting stuff coming there in Postgres type world. For Azure SQL, the change event streaming is in preview. So in near real time, as changes happen in my Azure SQL database, they will get streamed to Event Hub, which I can then do whatever I want with, send it to a downstream system, put it in a dashboard, whatever I want there. There's a new Azure SQL MI general purpose next gen tier. It's 3 to 5 times the performance. It halves the latency. I can have up to 500 databases per instance, 32 terabytes of storage with a slider for the IOPS and a slider for the memory. And now it has disk ANN vector indexing. So that Microsoft Research created algorithm that's really efficient for vector similarity searches, i.e. nearest neighbor, i.e. retrieval augmented generation for RAG. I can now use it in Azure SQL DB, Azure SQL MI, and SQL Database in Fabric. So those are all now available. And the Microsoft SQL VS Code extension now supports GitHub Copilot. So I can have natural language interactions to help me create T-SQL, explain my code, explain error message, give me just general information about all my database instances. And also long-term retention of Azure SQL backups now has immutability support. So I can ensure they can't be edited, they can't be deleted until a retention period has expired. Now, maybe that's for protection against ransomware attacks where they will try and delete my backups, but it may also just be to meet certain compliance and regulatory needs. And if I'm trying to migrate into Azure SQL Database, well, the Azure Database Migration Service is now integrated into Azure Arc. So it will actually make it easier to migrate into Azure SQL because there's fewer components, less portals I have to go and interact with. And this is not Azure specific, but SQL Server 2025 has gone GA with a lot of the SQL capabilities in Azure being evergreen. Hey, the new SQL Server 2025, those features, we're going to start finding those showing up in the Azure SQL instances. Speaking of which, there's a whole bunch of Azure SQL updates. So in GA, there's now extra memory options available in Azure SQL MI. There's improvements to the locking capabilities of the engine. It has regex support in the SQL queries and big int support in date add to enable larger date ranges. And in preview, I can actually now edit the data directly using the MS SQL extension in VS Code. I can also import and export DAC packs. So remember, DAC pack is the SQL schema, which is so the various database objects, the metadata, but not the actual row data. In AI, okay, ready? So API management is all about that runtime interface layer for your APIs. So naturally, it fits in with MCP as well. So it can take a managed API and make it an MCP endpoint just directly. You don't have to change anything about the backend API. Now, ordinarily, we think about creating specific knowledge and tooling in our MCP servers to work best with the AI app. Gives me a richer interaction. If I just need to quickly make an API available as MCP, this will let me do that. It can also act as a proxy for external MCP servers. And the benefit there is I could apply my APIM policies. I get the observability and the authentication. I have unified access and governance. I can help discover the MCP endpoints, and it will integrate with API Center, which is the design time partner of APIM. Also, it now supports the agent-to-agent APIs, and then go and register them in API Center. Azure AI Foundry has been renamed Microsoft Foundry. So everywhere we see Microsoft Foundry, that's what that is. The Foundry fine-tuning has had some fairly major changes. So it's an updated interface. It supports reinforcement fine-tuning for GPT-5 now. And it also has fine-tuning for models like Mistral using the same user interface, the same workflows, the same APIs as it would for GPT 4.1. Remember, fine-tuning goes beyond the regular few shot example. Like with few shot, I can just give some examples in the prompt and send it up. What with fine-tuning does is it actually tweaks the values of the parameters, the weights in the model. And there's also a developer training tier. So what developer training does, it uses spot, either spare capacity for a lower cost fine-tuning. Entra Agent ID in the registry is available in preview. This was a lot of what my session, Ignite, was about. It's part of Agent 365, which has various different SKUs related to match functionality you want, including free ones. But Agent ID gives a unique identity to every agent created in Copilot Studio, in Microsoft Foundry, Security Copilot, Microsoft Agent Framework. I can add identities for third parties. So they can also get an agent user ID if that agent needs to interact with an application that's really designed to work with user objects. Think a mailbox. I can't give a mailbox to an app service principal, a Teams account. So this is really important. So every agent gets its own identity for both granular permissions, but also I can audit it. These agent identities are always a child of an agent blueprint. That defines key characteristics, base permissions it can inherit. And it's the blueprint that actually does the authentication for the agent. But also we have owners. So we can always track who is the responsible human. Then we put governance on top of that. So the onboarding, the offboarding, users can assign packages permissions. It detects identity risk. I can assign conditional access to it. If the human owner changes, they leave, it can update and do all governance around that. And then the registry is a discoverability point. So agents can find agents, humans can find agents, and there are built-in collections. Like there's a quarantine. No one should be able to discover this one. But also I can create my own custom sets of collections. Hey, I want these agents to easily find each other. Remember, it's about discoverability. Think of it as the GAL for agent. It is not stopping agents talking to each other. That's what things like conditional access is for. The Foundry control plane is available in preview. So this is all about controls, observability, and security. So the guardrails and controls manage how agents use input, output, tool calls, tool responses. It's really the new name for content safety, but it's adding those two tool controls as well instead of just prompt input and output. Observability includes the ability to run evaluations with a lot of AI-powered evaluators. Because large language models and generative AI is non-deterministic, I can't check it's working okay just by running a test and expecting a fixed output. We have to use AI to evaluate, well, is it giving us the type of responses we would expect? So I can now run these evaluations ad hoc. I can run them continuously on production. I can schedule them to try and detect, hey, there's some drift in the behavior of my AI app that's using these generative models. It also includes groundness detection, task adherence, tool accuracy. It also has AI red teaming agent, which will try and use adversarial interactions to make my AI app do something it's not supposed to. I get telemetry, I get dashboards to understand, hey, how my agents are running. And again, security, it's going to use Entra Agent ID, but it can also use Defender for posture management. It can integrate with Purview for data protection. And the whole goal is this gets visualized into a single view across the Microsoft and other clouds. The Foundry model router has gone GA. Different models have different benefits. Some of them are better at reasoning. Some of them, for a simpler task, are better from a cost perspective. And so ordinarily, I, as the app writer, would have to have lots of model instances and then make decisions of where do I send it to. So what this does, it removes all of that. The model router provides a single chat completion API endpoint. And then on a per prompt basis, we'll pick the best model to optimize that cost and speed. So it can use the GPT-4 models, the GPT-5 models, DeepSeek, Llama, Grok, and more. So it's a single Foundry model deployment for you, and it will basically help you save money and remove a lot of the complexity. Foundry Local, which lets you run a number of models locally, has got some updates. So in addition to allowing you to run these on Windows and Mac, it now supports Android. So obviously Android is interesting for an on-device AI for mobile form factors. It supports the Whisper model, which is used for voice to text. So transcribe, translation, pairing that with the Android use, there's some really cool on-device things I can now do. Foundry IQ is available in preview. So this builds on Azure AI Search. But previously, we'd always have to think on a per agent level, okay, what data do we want to make available for the various types of capability it's doing? What Foundry IQ does is it works in a multi-layer approach. It lets me have a single source selection used across a range of knowledge sources. And these knowledge sources live within a particular knowledge base. So I make a query. When I make a query to the Foundry IQ, that query is broken up into subqueries. And then the subqueries are run across each of the AI selected knowledge sources from that knowledge base. The top responses from each of those different sources for each of those queries are then semantically ranked by that subquery. And then it semantically ranks them again and then takes a merged set of results, which gives me an answer. And it can iterate on this. I, as the customer, can select a level of reasoning effort from minimal, low, or medium, which will impact latency and cost. But it works across vectors in AI search from blob storage, from OneLake, remote searches against SharePoint, web via Bing, and MCP servers. So if I think about, I want to add intelligence to my agent, well, from all of those sources, I can go and hook into Foundry IQ to achieve that. The Foundry Content Understanding has gone GA. So this is using generative AI to process and ingest content like documents, images, videos, and audio into some user-defined format. With the GA, it also supports VNet integration. It supports managed identities. It supports custom managed keys and additional regions. And then the Foundry Agent Service has a number of updates. Remember, the Foundry Agent is an environment to both build and host agents with enterprise levels of security and scale. So it can host agents built with the Microsoft Agent Framework. Obviously, remember, Microsoft Agent Framework really brought together the best of the semantic kernel and AutoGen. So it supports those, it supports LangGraph, it supports Crew AI and other open source frameworks on a fully managed runtime. So it's going to automatically scale, it's going to monitor, it takes care of the security, the identity integration. And in preview, it now has a long-term memory capability. So agents can remember and adapt across different sessions and even workflows through this persistent layer. As a developer, I can group this memory into various topics. It will secure that memory at an Entra user identity level. So it can even be used in a multi-agent consistent experience. And I can build multi-agent workflows now with both a low code via a visual designer and pro code. So I can structure the orchestration, control the sharing of context, control the persistent state as part of that. And it also supports enterprise MCP server utilization. So that secure passing of credentials, which is always a gap in MCP servers. Well, now we have that OAuth support inside MCP servers. So the agent service will be able to leverage that. Foundry large language model speech is in preview. So this is all about transcription capabilities, and it understands the context of what is being said. It has multilingual support, so it's really good for captions, for subtitles, but also I'm a call center agent. It can help give me information about who I'm talking to and maybe other services that will help. It can transcribe voicemails, all things around there. Bring your own gateway is now available in preview for Foundry. So yes, it could be API management, but it could be Kong, MuleSoft, and others. So this will sit in front of my hosted models. Foundry AI templates are available in preview. So it's really just a ready-to-use template that I can customize for key use cases. A live voice agent, a multimodal context processing agent. I want to generate documents from a data and a whole bunch more. Foundry now has the Claude models in preview. So they can already be used in M365 Copilot, in GitHub Copilot, in Copilot Studio. But these models are really good for reasoning, code analysis, skill support. So it's the Cloud 4.1 Opus. That's the flagship reasoning model for deep analysis, for coding, multi-document synthesis. Cloud 4.5 Haiku. So that's the very fast, most cost-efficient for lightweight workloads. And then Claude 4.5 Sonnet balances reasoning with performance. Foundry now has an Azure Databricks connector which talks to Azure Databricks Genie. So Azure Databricks Genie is the natural language interaction ability for Databricks. So now Foundry can go and connect to that Genie space in Azure Databricks using MCP, so it can go and get the additional data and knowledge for my app I'm creating in Foundry. Also, the Azure Databricks Genie is available in Copilot Studio using that same MCP access. But Azure Managed Redis is also available as part of Microsoft Foundry MCP Tools Catalog now. And the Tools Catalog is fantastic. There's hundreds, thousands of different tools in there I can use in my models. Well, remember, Redis is really good as a knowledge store. But since it's all in memory, it's also a great store for the actual memory for my agents. So there's many different ways I can think about using Redis. And Durable AI Agents is in preview. So this integrates the Azure framework with Azure Functions Durable capability, which checkpoints during long-running tool invocations. It can coordinate over multiple agents. So I can use Azure Functions, things like, hey, I need a human approval as part of some agent workflow. And then Work IQ and Fabric IQ. So we talked about Foundry IQ already. So Foundry IQ, fantastic. Built on Azure AI Search, all those different knowledge sources, enables me to interact and get context for my agent. But these two siblings really complete that whole enterprise view. So Work IQ sits on top of the Microsoft Graph. Remember, Microsoft Graph is where all our Office documents, our Teams, chats, all of that information lives. But ordinarily, Microsoft Graph is just the items. And then if you look at things like Copilot, it builds a semantic layer of understanding on top of that. It understands what data matters for projects, who works together. It has memory for how the person works, their preferences. It connects all of those things. Well, now my agent can use that same semantic layer as the Microsoft Copilots. And then Fabric IQ adds semantic modeling on top of the data in Fabric. And remember, Fabric and its one lake can have data interactions with pretty much everything today. Now, this semantic modeling will build this ontology of what the data actually means to the business. And if I've already defined these semantic models in Power BI, it can just pull those in and start leveraging it. But again, now it enables AI interactions with all of the Fabric data via Fabric IQ about that business meaning. So if you add in Fabric IQ, Work IQ, and Foundry IQ, my agents now just get a complete view of everything that matters and data to my organization. Miscellaneous. Azure Site Recovery can now fail over back to Hyper-V, even if it's switched and started using a managed disk. There's a few caveats around it, but the documentation has all the detail on that. Azure Monitor now has a one-click onboarding in GA. So obviously monitoring is critical. So now for both AKS and virtual machines, with a single click, it will pick, hey, what are the right capabilities? What are the right best practice defaults? And just configure them. AKS will also include Prometheus logs for full Kubernetes insight. For VMs, it will use OpenTelemetry-based metrics. There are also now automatic recommended alerts for Azure monitored workspaces. Remember, that's used by Prometheus Managed Service. Azure Site Recovery now supports a major Linux OS upgrade. So in the past, I would have to disable the ASR replication. But now, as long as it's Azure to Azure, I can do a major RHEL or SLES OS upgrade. and it will carry on replicating. Also, ASR supports 5 times the churn. So changes. So now I can have up to 500 megabytes per second per VM of changes, and that will still carry on replicating. You won't get any lag behind that. So higher IOPS workloads will carry on functioning. Azure Monitor now has OpenTelemetry SDK stats in preview. So I can think about that if I'm having maybe bits of metrics missing from what I'm looking at, what this will do is it will actually help understand, well, what are the counts for item successes? What are the counts for items dropped and retried? And it has various dimensions related to the telemetry type, the reasons, the codes, to help maybe understand why I'm not seeing all the telemetry I would expect. There's also open telemetry-based visualizations in Azure Monitor for Azure VMs and Arc-enabled servers to, again, quickly gain insight into those. And Azure Monitor now has query-based metric alerts. So this is using PromQL on my Prometheus or OTel, my custom metrics that are stored in an Azure Monitor workspace. Again, Azure Monitor Workspace is that special type of workspace today, only used for Azure Managed Prometheus. And Azure Monitor Log Search now has dynamic thresholds. So instead of having to define, hey, based on this number of results alert, it will learn based on various seasonalities, so hourly, daily, weekly, what are the normal number we would expect to see? And then if there's some number outside of that normal threshold, it will alert us. And Azure Backup now has threat detection for virtual machines. So I've got my Azure Virtual Machine Backup store points. It will use Defender for Cloud to go and look for malware, for ransomware signatures, and more to help ensure my backups are healthy. Microsoft Marketplace has gone GA. So this originally launched in the US, but now it's available globally. This replaces the previous Azure Marketplace and AppSource. It's also got resale offerings from partners. API Management V2 has gone GA. This is the highest performing, the most capable version we've ever had. Speaking of that, API Center Standard is now included with APIM Standard and Premium tiers, which makes sense. If APIM is that runtime interaction layer, API Center is that development time, catalog, and inventory of everything. So now I actually get API Center included as part of that. Azure Copilot got a ridiculous number of new agents, all powered by GPT-5 reasoning across deployment, migration, optimization, observability, resiliency, troubleshooting, all designed to help me there. The Azure SRE, so the site reliability and event agent. So, hey, there's an incident. Hey, I need to automate a workflow. I want to set up proactive alerting. I want to set up scheduled tasks and routine. It will integrate with MCP servers. It has an adaptive memory to learn from prior incidents. I can even use no-code approaches to automate the various tasks. So that's got a whole bunch of updates there. And Entra has a crazy number of updates. So synced passkeys are now available. Previously, a passkey could only be stored in the Authenticator app, or obviously things like Hello for Business or YubiKey. But on a mobile, it was only the Authenticator app, which was device bound. Well, now I can leverage Apple iCloud Keychain and Google Password Manager, send the password sync within that ecosystem. And I can configure the type of passkeys on a policy level, which then apply to certain groups of users. There's a new recover your account option. So it will use a verified ID from one of 3 partners. So the user says, hey, I need to recover my account. My tenant has been configured to use one of the partners, Authentics, IDEMIA, True Credential. It would then get redirected to that partner. They would then validate I am who I say I am. I send them my passport, like a scan of it, or my driver's license or ID card. I smile. They make sure it's me. It gives me a verified ID, which I then present to Entra. Entra then does the live face check, make sure I match the verified ID, then looks up who I am in the graph, creates me a temporary access passcode to then onboard a passkey. So it really helps me recover around that. So it's totally cool. And there's also a whole bunch of Entra agents. So finding and creating apps that were from quick access in private access, finding high privileged apps that are not being used, and then finding an owner if it's missing, communicating with the owner, and then disabling it, which is a new capability. Finding conditional access policies that have too many exclusions, so they're rendered useless. Finding conditional access policies that don't have any exceptions, there's no break glass accounts. Access review agents, identity risk management agents. For internet access, the secure service edge GSA client internet access, it can help discover which AI services I'm using. It can detect and stop jailbreaking through that content protection capability in Foundry. It can detect I'm trying to send classified data or documents with classified data in it through a Purview integration. Now, these all use security compute units, but one of the things now is if I'm an M365 E5 customer, I get a certain amount of those security compute units. So I think it's 400 security compute units for every 1,000 user licenses, up to 10,000 SKUs per month. And that was it. Yep, ridiculous number of updates. Go and check out the Ignite book of news. But as always, I hope this was useful. Till next video, take care.